Back to another Boxscore Geeks show. As with the last couple of weeks, we just keep the hits on hitting and have another special guest. Super excited about this one. Ari, I recall a while back I wrote a post on healthcare, and your first comment to me was, "Why didn't you ask me first?" And I said, "I not as organized as you think." But luckily, we've got a producer. We got Brian. He's been honest to actually get these shows rehearsed, planned ahead of time. So we have Ari Caroline, who is the Chief Analytics Officer at Memorial Sloan-Kettering Cancer Center. You are solving the big things in the world, but you're also interested in basketball. So figure just as a brief intro, what do you do with Memorial Sloan-Kettering, and what with the analytics, what comparisons do you notice between that and basketball?
Okay, well, it gives me a little bit too much credit to say that I'm solving the big problems. I'm at the center of an institution that's got a lot of great people and a lot of great groups that are solving these problems, but it's an awesome place to be. So I get to see a lot of the progress that's happening, a lot of different areas contribute to that progress, maybe, suggest some directions for where we should be going in the future. But really, I consider myself to be very fortunate just to be at the center of all of it right now. So we're kind of unusual in the healthcare world in that we have an analytics team. And certainly on the scale that we have it, I think it's becoming a lot more common now. I just had a great conversation today with Joel Dudley from Mount Sinai, who's another Silicon Valley guy who's come east and is working with another great institution that has great data. But we've got started at this more than 10 years ago, actually. 11 years ago, I started at Sloan-Kettering. I was in a PhD program in financial economics at Yale. And my father-in-law, who's a biostatistician at Sloan-Kettering, has been with Sloan-Kettering for some 35 years, had done some work for administration, saw great potential in the data that we had, and they said they wanted more, and he recommended me for some summer work, and I did some summer work, and they said they still wanted more, and so we by divine serendipity, we're just expecting our fourth child at the time, and we're realizing that a $25,000 PhD stipend wasn't going to cut it anymore. So we cut short that program, and I went to work full-time at Sloan-Kettering and just started to build up the team. And what's really great is, we started with just answering operational questions. How many ORs should we be opening up? Where should we be putting a new regional site? And then as we were answering those and, thank God, with some success, we were realizing at the same time the potential that the same data could offer us to answer some important clinical questions. And we started doing tests on our data to just see how robust the data were and what it would take to actually use that data to answer important clinical questions. And one of the big tests that we gave ourselves was, could we replicate a prospective comparative effectiveness study using just Sloan-Kettering's internal retrospective data? And we showed that we were able to do that. We found a large prospective study in non-small cell lung cancer comparing two drugs, pemetrexed and gemcitabine. And it showed a clear superiority for one of them, for pemetrexed. And the first thing we were able to do, which is very exciting, was just replicate the cohorts that they had in the study, to replicate the eligibility criteria for that study just in our patients. And then when we actually ran the Kaplan-Meier curves, the survival curves, and saw that we got the exact same survival difference between those two drugs, it was very, very exciting. Now, what I'm skipping is all of the work it took in between, because we have better data, we have more robust data, much more structured data than most organizations out there. But there were still a lot of data points that we didn't have in the structured data, important ones that we had to collect. And that's actually generated a lot of the analytics efforts that we've started since then, which has been something that probably doesn't have a natural parallel in the basketball analytics, which is, how do you make sense of data that's unstructured? So in our case, there's a lot of text data.
A question on that actually is,
Sure.
For sports, something that bugs me that people seem to not realize is just how structured the data is. They we lump sports analytics in with other analytics, like what you're saying, where you've got all of this unstructured data. I heard a talk you gave, and you've got basically doctors' handwritten reports, and there's important information in there. But how do you line up all those reports to actually get something useful? Basketball is one of this place. You go to Draft Express, we have players' heights, wingspans, age. You go to Basketball Reference, you've got all of their stats back from whatever. If you go to stats.nba.com, they're getting even better, where we're saying, like, I get in arguments about Russell Westbrook. We have exact data on how much he touches the ball, how long he holds the ball in a game. So much of the data in basketball is structured that when people talk about the problems with big data, I don't think they realize how clean the sports world is for all that.
Yeah, so big data really is a world for unstructured data. The whole NoSQL architecture is built around the notion that you don't actually have defined relationships between fields. And for us, all of these, right, basketball is the data that are available are very structured. And the truth is, if as long as you can write a good scraper, it's all available to you. So I'm reluctant to use my analysts to do that for us in healthcare, to actually ask them to help me out in the MBA realm. But so I sometimes struggle with the data that are available to me. Yes, it's all there, and it's all in a structured form. It's a lot easier than having to do natural language processing on text notes, for physician text notes, to have to make sense of imaging, which is another realm of machine learning that we're involved with. We just announced our new Center for Nanotechnology and Molecular Imaging.
Wow, that's really cool.
Yeah.
As you may know, I think I've talked about this. In a past life, I was a computer scientist, and my work was on computer vision and analyzing images. It was for faces, so much at a higher level, doing machine learning for that. And I've been out of the field for over 5 years now, and I know it's blown me by, but it was in a past life an interest of mine.
Oh, I have to get you back involved then.
Well, I have
So
good people here to talk to. So I guess I want to go. We've got the draft and player analyst talk, and hopefully we get to talk more healthcare. There's some good spoilers. If we don't get as much into healthcare on this podcast as you might hope, dear listener, just be aware that I will be bugging Ari after this podcast to have him on again. And that's going to be, I guarantee, Ari, regardless of how far we get in this podcast, that will be true. So just as a wrap up, what would you say the biggest, oh, so I guess what's the biggest difficulty you have in healthcare analytics versus basketball? And are there any, this is interesting to me, are there any difficulties in basketball analytics that you don't see as much of in your healthcare analytics?
So if it's okay, I'll start with that second one,
Sure.
because I think it's the more unique case. And I think the answer, to me at least, in the work that I've done, has been in isolating causality. Now, it's isolating causality is difficult in whatever realm you're working in, and you have to make sure you're holding all the right factors constant. But in basketball, the circularity is so strong that it becomes especially difficult. So right, so you can't just look at assists if you're not holding everything else constant that's associated with that assist, right? Because that, the assist actually means that somebody scored a basket. So you can't just take pure assists and say how predictive of it is that of how many baskets were scored, because by definition, if there was an assist, there was a basket. And so you can start to do things like take assist rate, the percentage of baskets that were assisted, and see how that relates to shooting percentage. And there are other things that you can do, but the circularity of the box score stats can be challenging, and it's manageable, but it's a lot of work, and it's something that I've had to spend a lot of time on to make sure that my regressions are clean.
Yeah, that is, Dave will be happy to hear that, because I know regressions are really popular on the net. And, at least once a month he comes up and says, here's a brand new regression from a stat site. And he's like, it's not modeled right, so we can't even use that. And then, so, I mean, I know the other question has got to be much easier to answer, but, if you've got a little time, I'd be happy to hear what are your big struggles on the healthcare side?
Yeah, so I mean, it's really around the realm I was discussing before, that it's finding all the right data points and making sure you have them, and it's making sure that you have them in a consistent manner. So we have an incredible luxury at Sloan-Kettering of the amount of structured data that we have, the number of patients that we see, and that we see those patients over a longitudinal period of years and years. So there's tremendous amount that's actually captured. And so, I think there are be a lot of people who would be very happy to start with what we have just in raw data form. But if we're actually trying to use it for clinical decision making, it's still insufficient. And so to be able to capture those extra fields to make sure that the fields that are already captured are captured consistently requires mining through lots and lots of unstructured data in lots of different forms and then reconciling it with whatever we have from other sources. And so if you ask a simple question like, is this a metastatic patient, right? Well, unfortunately, there's not a vetted checkbox that every doctor clicks and says, this patient, this patient is clearly a metastatic patient with metastases to the lung and to the brain or whatever it may be. That seems like it would be a very natural structured field, but it's actually somewhat nuanced. And local metastases are treated differently than distant metastases, and so it is captured. It's captured in all kinds of different forms, some of them structured, some of them unstructured. But if you want to just ask the question the way a doctor would ask the question if they're interested in starting a new clinical trial, you actually have to consider all of those sources, structured and unstructured, and use some Bayesian algorithms to actually establish a confidence about what the actual composite answer should be.
Oh, that stuff is, you're bringing back graduate school projects. This is awesome stuff. So we're actually going to go back a step then, because as we've mentioned, basketball data is much more structured. And I think in the pre-show, you actually mentioned much more simple. So I'm going to take a quick break. We don't actually have sponsors. So what we do here on the Boxscore Geeks show is we give shout outs to our amazing fans. Today's shout out is going to go to Kenny Pickett. I hope I pronounced that right. Also, one of the most interesting profiles I found on Twitter. Kenny Pickett apparently writes music for pro wrestlers is the first thing listed. But what I did is I wrote a piece today about Kawhi Leonard. Geez, I'll get his name right one of these days, and made the note that the Spurs are one of only two teams to ever have 3 Finals MVPs on them at the same time. That's true if you only look at Finals MVPs for that team. But the Celtics in 1984 and 1986 had Dennis Johnson, Cedric Maxwell, Bill Walton, and Larry Bird between those 2 years on their team. So good job catching a trivia question I missed, because kind of interesting question. I asked the question wrong. I said, how many Finals MVPs for the team they're playing on played at the same time? I didn't ask the question, were they Finals MVPs on other teams? So an interesting case of where it slipped through the cracks. Thanks, Kenny. And on that note, we're going to start talking about basketball player qualities. For the Wages of Wins and Boxscore Geeks, you've written several great posts about how to look at data. One of my favorite pieces is on transparent data analysis. You basically, in a very well thought out manner, said every problem I had with RPM for ESPN. And that's one of my favorite pieces to date. And then you've also looked at some other stuff, like you and Arturo have looked at floor stretch, and you've been doing analysis of draft players. So I guess what I'm going to start out with actually is we've got the draft coming up, and you've started looking at draft players. When you're looking at analytics, I know you're using the Wages of Wins technology a lot, but you're approaching this as, from your mind, a chief analytics officer. How do you approach the draft, and what stats do you look at? And like, what would you tell to sports teams that are still, going down the rabbit hole, as we like to say?
Well, as Dave likes to say, basketball is basketball, no matter where it's played or, at what level. And so, the same qualities that contribute to wins in the NBA are going to be the qualities that contribute to wins in college basketball as well. Now, they're not the only qualities, and Dave also cautions about over-assessing the predictability of any one given measure, and your productivity in college is not the sole factor to consider in terms of potential productivity for the NBA. But from my perspective, I was just trying to lay out the college players in terms of how productive they were using the measures that we know that we know about in their college careers. So it's not necessarily meant to say here are the players that should be drafted and here are the players who shouldn't be drafted. It was simply to say here are the players who've performed really well in college. And that is one significant predictive factor for who might perform very well in the pros as well. And it's probably the significant factor. I think other ones that come up are, you know, age and height, and particular schools tend to produce better NBA players. In some of the regressions that Artur has run, I haven't actually done those regressions myself. So my model, I haven't created my own model for that's meant to be a predictive model for who will be a good NBA player, but I think we learn a lot just looking at who's been a good college player.
It's funny on the schools, there's a lot of chicken and the egg stuff there, because first you've got good schools tend to produce better players, but they also have better, draft, they get their pick of the top high school prospects. And then Arturo's actually mentioned this. He's looked at players he's missed, and one of the things he noticed is that unlike the NBA, a college team can just get all of the best players. And Dave's mentioned this too, right? Kentucky, I think, has top high school prospects that are going to be coming off the bench, which for a one and done system has to be interesting to that high school prospect. And so now you run into this weird problem where you've got, well, the school is already going to have better players, but then that school is also going to make some of those better players look worse. But then that school might make, so like what you're saying, trying to view why they look good or bad in college gets very complicated very quickly. But I think to your point, the problem isn't that teams don't know what to look at. I think one of your pieces, and I actually apologize, Brian, I did not put this one on the list of links, but you looked at basically minutes played versus wins produced per 48 in all positions, point guard through center. And what you basically notice is point guard, the NBA has it figured out. They're looking for players that can pass, that can shoot pretty well, that can, not turn the ball over. But then you start getting to other positions and things like centers, they don't realize that they need to play centers that can rebound. And so I think for college, they figured out that, yeah, age and height matter, but they're missing that, a player that's not good in college, that's already, if they're not beating up college players, why do you think they're going to come into the NBA and start being able to perform against a much harsher competition?
Yeah, and players, you go to the Kentucky question again, and a player like James Young, who seems to be living entirely based on his high school reputation, because he never really, was tested enough in college to actually to be the level of a contributor where you could actually assess his performance, in any way comparable to what some of the other potential draftees have contributed. And actually, and his per minute contribution is quite poor. He's the lowest on the list that I have right now. So they certainly, are not looking subjectively in terms of how the players have performed so far. And there's this notion of, physical potential that's probably way overassessed, because, if the player has that physical potential, you would hope that it would actually have translated into some basketball skill at that point.
Yeah, I mean, that to me is one of the, it's funny because I know I started the podcast talking about how structured so much of the data is in the NBA, but basketball intelligence, I don't know how you would structure that. I don't know how you would look at that. But, Artur and I get in these arguments all the time about players like Russell Westbrook and DeMarcus Cousins. And my argument is, look, they have all the skills and talent in the world, but they're making dumb decisions on a regular basis. And your argument is maybe they can go to a new system and do better. And my argument is I don't think that's as fungible as people think. I don't think it's as easy to just flip a switch in your head and suddenly start being a smarter basketball player. Even Carmelo Anthony, who's seen an amazing resurgence in New York, best irony in the world that New York fans are mad at them. This is what we've been wanting to play like for years. He's still not at LeBron's level. I don't think it's as easy to say, I have a body like LeBron James. All someone has to do is tell me three things and suddenly I'll start playing like him.
Well, so the interesting question is, first of all, I agree with you. I don't think we see major changes in individual players, or if we do, they're certainly the exception to the rule. Carmelo actually had incredible performance in his play for the U.S. team. I don't know what his wins produced per 48 was, but it was quite high, and he played at a completely different level. And we know that, relative to, any point any point on the court, and considering whether he's covered or not, he actually shoots for a very high percentage, considering the shots that he's taking. He just takes a lot of very poor shots, right? So you would think that there are some things that you could change. Now, what those things are and to what extent you can change them, I think that's not my level of expertise. I would just say that we don't see that it happens very often. So one of the things that really struck me about last year's draft was Sam Hinkie, who we all know knows a little bit about basketball, drafting Michael Carter-Williams. So Michael Carter-Williams I actually had as a pretty low, he was pretty low on my prospect list. He was certainly below average. He was not one of the ones that I put the buyer beware label on.
But he was I'm looking at your, and we'll put a link to this. You put up a draft prospect last year. He was right around average is what you had on him.
Okay, right around average. I'll take that. And so I started to play around with it and see what the factors were that were keeping him from being a higher level prospect. And certainly it was his 3-point shooting, and to a lesser extent it was his turnovers. And it was just a question to pose to myself is, does Sam Hinkie think I can transform this guy? Or is he saying I can bring in a guy who's going to score a lot of points, get Rookie of the Year, and then use that as trade value for somebody who I value more? I don't know exactly what he was thinking, but the thought did cross my mind that there are some player characteristics that are more teachable than others. So I was disappointed looking at this year's list and seeing that Nick Stauskas wasn't above average because, I'm a Michigan guy and I root for the Michigan players. And McGarry looks great for the few minutes that he played in 2013. But Nick Stauskas actually came out below average, and it bothered me a lot because he shoots for a great percentage, right? He takes quality shots, right? He shoots either for three-pointers or he drives to the basket and takes high percentage shots. He gets a lot of assists. So I was wondering why he was still below average, and the reason is he almost never steals the ball. His steals are so below average for the position that it kept him at average. He's not really below average among the draft players for his position, but he's around average. And that's something that, somebody with good basketball instincts, you think really could be taught, right? If he could be taught to look for a few more steals, and he could up it to get one more steal per game, he would instantly be one standard deviation above the mean.
So and this is all hypothesizing on my part. Like, this is something Arturo mentioned. So
I'm hypothesizing as well.
But so what I'm saying is, as we mentioned in basketball, one thing we know is there's only one ball. That's why we've never gotten around to this, but I know you, me, and I think Josh Weiler were having this discussion about kind of, the value of a shot. We're misdoing it, because not only is it bad if I take a below average shot from my position, that shot has to come from somewhere. So if I'm Russell Westbrook and I'm taking a shot and I use all of the point guard shots that we've allocated for my team, I have to start taking shooting guard shots and then small forward shots and then power forward shots. And so instead of having a 56% center shot, I've got a 53% point guard shot, which is much worse than when I was taking a 53% point guard shot as a point guard shot. If that makes any sense. Listeners, if you followed that, you are better than me, and I said it. So
the way I translated your question, Trey, I think in that email exchange was, does the opportunity cost of a shot increase as you take more shots, right?
Yes.
So is there a fixed opportunity cost to each shot that you take, and it's the same across as the game goes along, or as a single player takes more shots, does the opportunity cost of that shot increase? I think it's a difficult question to answer. I'm inclined to say that it makes more sense to treat all shots the same, because at any given point in the game, right, if you're going to be taking a good shot, if it's a high percentage shot for no matter where you are and what position that you're in, it's still a high percentage shot. If you hit that shot, right, it contributes to the team. Now, if you're taking that shot away from another high percentage shot, we're going to actually see that result in you know, the number of shots you hit, right? So if Carmelo Anthony was taking all of these, you know, contested, ill-advised shots, but actually, you know, at a true shooting percentage of 60%, we wouldn't care, right?
Yeah. Well, so actually,
So
I guess
if we go ahead.
I was just going to say the point is the wins produced formula has two parts. The first is just your productivity. But then we go one step further and we say basketball is not, everybody's not the same player. There are point guards and centers and bigs and smalls. And so we compare them against their average. So almost to your point, I'm almost wondering if shooting efficiency shouldn't be compared to your position. There should just be a baseline. And we just say the average shot in the NBA is approximately 53.5% goes in. And if you're not hitting that rate, no matter what your position, we're looking at it that way. Because if we're looking at it the way we do, which is we compare you to position, you get this weird thing where a player that's in a weaker position, like Kobe Bryant, can just take a ton of shots and look really good. But the reality is those shots came from a center. Those shots came from Shaquille O'Neal or Pau Gasol or Andrew Bynum. And that I'm wondering if that should be considered.
Right. Well, that gets us to the whole consideration of the, you know, the position adjustment in general, which is, you know, the whole floor stretch discussion that we had. So my speculation was that there were other value markers that maybe we could capture using some of the box score stats as proxies that would explain why we value these small players and put them on the floor when on average they contribute less to a win when you look at raw productivity than the big players. And we know that, you know, it wouldn't work if you put 5 centers on the floor. We know that there is some compromise that you have to maintain. But the question is, could we quantify that value that the small players players contribute if it's not in the form of the box score? And that's actually a place where I struggled a bit. You know, even in my revised regressions that I use, that put greater opportunity cost, they put greater negative cost on a missed shot. They put greater value in an assist, and they put greater value, a relative value for the three-pointer. There's still a slope that goes from the small players to the high players, where the high players contribute more. And so I still have that position adjustment. I do a continuous position adjustment. I don't do an average position adjustment. And my rationale for that at this point is similar to what I've said in the floor stretch pieces, which is that there's opportunity cost to the floor space, literally to the floor space, right? So you can't have everyone underneath the basket grabbing rebounds, and there's a limited supply of rebounds to go around, right? And if you're not taking the three-pointers, there are other costs to that as well, and Arturo's done some work in that regard. You know, I think it's still an open question, and I think your question is still pertinent in that regard. But I think in the end, we have to say that there's, you know, some balance that has to be, everyone's going to accept there has to be a balance between the small players and the big players. It doesn't have to be the exact balance that the NBA has traditionally followed, which is a point guard, a shooting guard, a small forward, power forward, and a center. But there has to be some balance between the small players and the big players, and the small player stats and the big player stats. And so therefore there has to be some sort of adjustment that's made for those small players.
Well, so to that point, I actually have two parts. So coming back to the initial Michigan question, as I was kind of saying, and what we're mentioning here is this opportunity cost, right? There's only one ball, and each possession there's only a few players, right? In each possession, maybe 4 players, if you count the rebound to the shot, can really get on the stat sheet. And while we want to mix those up, that's one of the issues with college that Arturo was talking about. So I'm trying to give you a little hope for your Michigan guy whose name I've already forgotten, but
Nick
Stauskas. So the basic point there is, if Michigan is just too good at getting steals, then the regression in the NBA says, well, a steal is a steal. It doesn't matter. If you're really good at steals, you're not stealing those steals from your teammates. I could buy in college, though, that your team's just too good, and there's only so much you can do on defense. You can't be the main guy on defense like you would in the NBA. So maybe he's a little better than he looks. You can bug Arturo about that.
Maybe I would put a little bit more stock in the hope that he could actually be taught to anticipate a little bit more and increase his steals in the NBA, because it's not a skill that you would say that is, is unteachable. He certainly has NBA caliber talent. And if you said he couldn't shoot in college, that might be a little bit more of a stretch. If you said, he's constantly taking bad shots, we know that's a behavior that's difficult to change. But this is one behavior that I think is a little bit more changeable. I do see in some other players, the trade-off between what your role is on the team and the stats that you're getting. So Adrian Payne, I like the stretch players. We know that there are, some stretch players in the NBA, bigs who can rebound and shoot the three, who do very well in terms of wins produced. And Adrian Payne, you'd expect to be that, to fit like the Kevin Love model. He shoots the three-pointer very well for a high percentage. He also, can play underneath and get a lot of rebounds. So when I do a continuous position adjustment, that's based on the stats. And so the stats say that he is a big, and the reason is because he gets a lot of defensive rebounds, but very few assists. Even though he takes three-pointers, he gets so few assists that he's clearly defined as a big. And even as a big, his ratio of defensive rebounds to offensive rebounds is very high. And so there's clearly a cost that he's experiencing of taking these outside shots, these three-pointers, where he's not crashing the boards and getting offensive rebounds. And I can't tell you, since I'm not somebody who's got significant playing or coaching experience myself, I can't tell you how Kevin Love does it, how he takes three-pointers and still gets offensive rebounds, but he does.
Yeah, Kevin Love's amazing. I don't.
Yeah, so Adrian Payne. Adrian Payne was another one that was a surprise for me. Another Big Ten player at Michigan State. That's a rival school, but he was someone I was expecting to rank higher and didn't because of that. And it was partially because of his role on the team, but again, the great players seem to transcend those roles, and he did not.
Oh, and so to finish up because I've told Brian I've had this problem where I'll say two parts and then I forget the second part. So the second part is a topic you and I have discussed a lot, which is how much you should blame the player versus the coach. Dirk Nowitzki is the common one. I don't care what Mark Cuban says. Dirk Nowitzki on the Mavericks is treated as a power forward. We can look at all the data. Now, you're when we talk position adjustment, we might be right that Dirk has all the skills to where he could be plugged into a different system and be better. How much of that do we blame on Dirk? How much of that do we blame on the system? That's an interesting question, and also bring together kind of this college system as to who does what. And then following up on what you had just said, which is fascinating to me, you were talking steals, you were talking offensive rebounds, is that it's these tiny margins in what makes a player good versus great. It's I think one of those things that people miss about Kobe Bryant, for instance, versus Steve Nash. Kobe Bryant shoots 55% true shooting. Steve Nash shoots 59% true shooting. That's 4%, which means over 100 shots, Steve Nash is going to score, and we're adjusting for shot type, on about 4% more of those than Kobe. That is not viewable. And even to you're saying you're a big college fan, you watch these games, you know these players, you expect them to be great. You look and you go, why not? And it's this very tiny margin, which is why, just wrapping this all back together, because I want to wrap us up, I'll say we'll do healthcare for another podcast because I don't want to keep you late. And I'm more than happy to know that we'll keep having you on and on and on. But to your point is, transparent analysis is important because it's these tiny things that differentiate good to great players. And if we don't know what we're looking at, you can't explain to people, well, the reason, a good example is he actually got some love this year, is Joakim Noah. The reason Noah is so much better than we think for a center is he gets 2 more assists per game than an average center. And that's really hard to notice.
Yeah, well, I think with him it's probably more noticeable than with others. I think that prototype of a center who passes the ball a lot. And by the way, Mitch McGary is on the border between a small forward and power forward for me because he is that prototype of the Joakim Noah and now his name's slipping my mind, the big guy on the Spurs who was
Thiago Splitter.
No, who was passing the ball all the time.
Diaw.
Boris Diaw, right? Yeah. And so he's really that prototype. And since I do a continuous position adjustment, and it's calculated based on the stats, Joachim Noah. I don't know actually how he pronounces it in his family. If it's probably his French father probably pronounces it Joachim. But I think everyone calls him on the radio Joachim. Um, the you know he's, by my calculation, he's somewhere between a small forward and a power forward. He is not functioning as a center, and he's really great. Even if he was a center, he would still be above average, right? But he's playing a role that's very different on the team. And you're right, Dirk Nowitzki was the prototype for where my continuous position, calculated position adjustment gave very different results from traditional ones produced. And I actually stand by it. And I think what you opened up with is the main reason for it. Even if the coach slots him in as a power forward, the only real difference that makes is that the coach is not putting in another power forward. They know how he plays the game. They know where on the court they expect him to be in the style of play that they expect from him, right? So put in another power forward. The fact that the coach didn't put in another power forward with him is the coach's problem. It's not Nowitzki's problem. They know how Nowitzki plays, and he's very good at how he plays. Even at this age, he still scores very highly using my calculated position adjustment. So I would stand by that. I understand.
Oh, I agree, and that's just the distribution. It's a hard argument to get into because one argument we always make is we can only tell you the stats we've seen. So that makes life harder. And so what we've seen is we've seen Dirk as a power forward. But to the same point, you know me, I mean, one of my first piece at Wages of Wins, my pieces over time, my Carl watch, I am all about saying we have these good players and we have coaches, I sincerely believe that Ronaldo Balkman should have been a fantastic NBA player. He should have been a Kurt Rambis, Birdman-like player, getting 2,000 minutes a game, being a major part of a key team. And, he ended up back in Puerto Rico and getting in trouble for choking a coach, I think, instead of being a great NBA player. When I look over his career, how much of that blame do I put on him versus on his coach?
Right, and if they're actually being assigned a role where they're expected to play a different role, that's one thing. I think for the players that we're talking about, the teams have embraced the role that they play, and so we shouldn't, in the analytics world, penalize them just because of the position that they're listed on in the box score.
Or if we're going to put the penalty, put it on the right person, put it on the coach for not.
That's right. That's right. And the penalty on the coach is not for the way Dirk is playing; it's for not putting in a true power forward, right?
And to be fair, when they turned things around is when they got Sean Marion, who was a small forward, but really by your continuous adjustment, I would imagine is a power forward.
Absolutely, is a power forward. Yes, yeah, and there are several others like that. So I actually, from last year's draft, DJ Stevens, who 6'5" guy, with the greatest hops in the world, and it's a crime that he's still not in the NBA. I think he played in Turkey this past year. Had tremendous stats per 40 stats. And that was even with being 6'5" player. I had him as a heavy power forward because that's the way he played the game. He played the game underneath, and he was getting lots of rebounds and lots of blocks. And even so, even as a power forward, as a 6'5" power forward, he was dominant. And we see that with Charles Barkley also, right? You can be, not fit the prototype, the NBA prototype, and still contribute well at a position that doesn't fit that prototype. We see it with big players playing small positions, and we see it with small players playing big positions.
All right, so we've just about hit time. We've talked a ton of, I know I write up the notes. I'm going to have to look up a lot of players for this, which is exciting. We're going to have a piece out by you with your draft prospects, your top 100 from Draft Express, and maybe another one as well out. Just throwing it out there. Kem Birch, hope I got his name right, looks to be the steal of the draft. And as you mentioned, James Young looks to be the landmine of this draft. To make Dave happy, again, we don't know. This is just our best guess, and there are many other scouts. Yeah.
I would say that, the teams that end up with Jordan Adams, Kyle Anderson, and Kem Birch are all going to be very happy with the results. I think it's pretty amazing that two UCLA guards, UCLA had a great year this year and must have been the result of some great play by some great players, and those two look amazing. So, and by the way, Jordan Adams, it's almost entirely driven by steals. The guy is just, his hands are like magnets. So I would say all three of those, Arturo's algorithm predicted Kawhi Leonard, it predicted Kenneth Faried. Less successful with the Jay Crowder, although we'll still give him some time. I think if who the equivalent is in this year's draft, it's going to be Kyle Anderson, Jordan Adams, or Kem Birch.
Yeah, and well, I mean, to be fair, even Arturo says my draft model is very good. It hits about 40% of the time. That means we expect more misses than hits. And so when we have a year where, I mean, that year the three Arturo really liked were Kyrie Irving, Kenneth Faried, Kawhi Leonard. All right, well, two or three of those players hit. Irving's above average, but he is not. He did not turn into great, and I don't think he will. So I mean, that's 2 for 3. That means Arturo had a good year. He's up about 20% from what we'd expect.
I would take 2 for 3. I would if you were to force me to put money on it, I would guess that of the I don't know how many it is. I have 8 or 9 players that are above the 1.5 standard deviation mark of the top 100 list. I would bet of those that are that high. Again, I would say if you ask me about those who are above average, I'd say 40% is about a 40% hit rate is about what I'd expect. But of those that are above 1.5 standard deviations, I would expect a hit rate of closer to 75, 80%.
That would be awesome. Okay, so I'll let you get the last word on basketball analytics before we meet again. Then I'll give my shout out, and that'll be the show.
All right. Well, I mean, I think you've actually pulled it all out of me. So, I think there are some great discussions going on. I think there are great discussions still to be had about what's still missing. I think there's still stuff missing from the box score that we'd still like to have. We know that it's not captured in some other things like, plus minus, or even adjusted plus minus. Some of it might be captured there, but there are some things that we'd still love to see. I mean, I'd actually pose that question to you if we had enough time, but I can tell you if there were 2 box score stats that I would really love to see, it would be shots hit and attempted by the opponent that player is covering, and turnovers generated. So not just the steals, but when you take a block, when you take a charge, when you force a bad pass and the player you're covering throws it out of bounds. I would love to see those captured, and I think that would actually add to the predictive power of our algorithms. Actually,
charges are an annoying one that are doable. Those are in the play-by-play. As you mentioned at the beginning of the show, just like who has the best scraper. Some of us. Yep. Having more time, there are actually some amazing people who do great scraping on the web that we should bug more. But yeah, I mean, there's more box score stuff to be had, and I'm just excited. And as I mentioned with your work, I just want people to use it the right way. What I keep seeing is people get this great new data and scurry off in the wrong direction, and I go, "You're such a good talent. You're looking in the wrong place. If you just come back here, we can advance this field." And on that note, my last shout out for the day is going to be to R.C. Buford, who despite having 13 or 12 years of sustained success, never having a below 50 win season with the Spurs, has only won 1 Executive of the Year award, which only came this year. So RC, we love you. You're our shout out. You're our second shout out for the week. And yeah, everybody on the internet, keep doing the great stuff you're doing, and we'll see you next week.
Take care.